I mean, I used to go up to Liverpool and work on the knocker and buy antiques. And there were people in Liverpool at that time, a lot younger. There was Vincent Coggins and the Huyton crew, but at that time they were robbing post offices. They were sort of armed robbers, and doing their thing in the late 80s. But then everyone turned their attention to the drugs business because the vast amounts of money that could be earned. And then Dickie and Francis Coggins moved to the Canny Farm brothers, moved to Marbella. And then what happened? We went through the 90s and there was all the dance music and everyone was loving each other and all that. And then they replaced the ecstasy and the dancing with cocaine. And then what happened? We saw in the 2000s the rise of the Irish cartel, the Kinahan cartel, with Christy Kinahan Sr., Daniel Kinahan, and Christopher Kinahan Jr.
To them names, what you've just been speaking about. Well, let's bring it back to the 80s when you're speaking about Dickie Coggins and Francis Coggins. So they were pavement robbers, was they?
Well, I think they do anything. You know, they were just career criminals, and they were doing well. I think Dickie last got arrested in '89 up in Scotland on a post office thing. But then what they discovered was that the drug business was so lucrative, but they were always careful. I mean, for 30 years, never used a mobile phone, would only speak in person. And then, which still amazes me, they all got captured by the Encro chat, which, is unbelievable, really, for people that secretive, that careful, to allow themselves to be suckered into a system. Because as you know, Darren, there's no such thing as an encrypted service. It's only encrypted until they crack it.
Yeah, so when we're speaking about the Coggins and their associates doing robberies, was their associates like Gerard and individuals like that?
Yeah, Uncle Bobby Gerard. There was who else? Michael Earl, Edward Jarvis, John Burns, Wayne Pearson. He's like the ghost. He just gets in the graft, gets a chunk of money, couple of million, and then goes away for a couple of years.
So, them names you've just mentioned, mate, was they doing the pavement robberies together in the 80s?
Well, they were doing that, a bit of fraud, a bit of dealing in stolen property. If they got antiques or anything like that, I'd probably buy some of them off of them. That have been stolen.
So basically, the names you've just spoke about there in the 80s, doing the crimes that they used to commit before they turned to dealing drugs. Yeah. Basically, what we're looking at now in the year 2020s, basically, is they are supposedly and allegedly the Liverpool Mafia, aren't they?
Yeah, well, yes. Well, I mean, as you know, it's very tribal. So you've got the group from Huyton Dovecot. You got a group from down in Speke. You got a group from over the water on the Wirral. That was the Mohays, degenerate gamblers they were. But again, they were under the radar and no one ever knew anything about it. Then you got this influx, as we say, of the Irish cartel, and the bridge between the Liverpool underworld, Merseyside underworld, and the Irish cartel was a man called Tony Judge. He was the bridge that brought them together.
I know Tony Judge, and I've known Tony Judge all my life. He supplied the firearms to the kids that tried to kill me, which came from the Kinahans. But I've known Tony Judge since he was around the banker. You're aware who the banker is?
Philip Glennon.
Yeah, Philip Glennon Senior. So anyway, we'll go back to the Coggins because I've been quite interested in that family for quite a few years. I know these are the Huyton and the West Derby firm. They're from them ends, but they've always had a good impact upon organised crime a bad impact upon organised crime within the city. I just want to go a bit deeper on them and their ability to. You named a few names, likes of John Burns. I've had a bit of intelligence of that. Is it John Burns? Yeah.
Yeah, John Burns, who I describe as the first Scouser billionaire in the drug business.
Yeah, well, John Burns, I was getting a lot of intelligence about him a good couple of months ago, and I believe he was working with the Serbians in South Africa, wasn't he? Having the Serbians doing all crazy mad stuff in South Africa recently.
yeah, what happened, you see, was John Burns' story in the late 80s. He got hold of a chemist who could make ecstasy so they didn't have to import it from the Netherlands. So they made an absolute fortune. All the Huyton crew, the Canny Farm brothers, they made a fortune. But then John Burns moved to South Africa and he started importing drugs to send down to Australia. Because in Australia, you can get 5 times the amount of profit because it's more expensive. And so he was working with Serbians. They lost a load of a ton of cocaine and John Burns refused to pay them. So the Serbians sent out a hit team of 6 hitmen to South Africa, but John Burns had mercenaries working for him and they wiped out all the 6 of them. And it was all over the place, papers. They were finding dead bodies all over South Africa. But they managed to...
Sorry, mate. It got to the point where they planted an IED under the car of John Burns, didn't they?
Well, it's worse. Yeah, worse than that. They put a bomb under the seat of his armour-plated Range Rover. When it blew up, because it was armour-plated, right, he survived, but he lost his behind, and he was in hospital for months having reconstructive surgery of his backside. He then moved to Dubai. And latest on John Burns is he's working with the Albanians, sending in huge amounts of Class A narcotics to the UK. See, everyone focuses on the Kinahans because they're all in the news, but they're not the only ones out there. They're not the only cartel that's operating. I mean, no one really knows of John Burns. And as I say, he was the first Scouser billionaire with a B that no one really knows much. You know, of course you do. But your average public don't know about him.
So you mentioned other names there before, and one in particular was Jarvis, mate. Is that the same Jarvis that was arrested and was a snitch for the Newcastle authorities back in the 90s, or is this a different Jarvis?
I think is it on the John Carrington, the Carrington case.
Yeah, he was co-accused with Warren, wasn't he?
Curtis Warren, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, look, these are old names that have been floating around. Michael Earl, Woody Woodford. We got Edward Jarvis. You got Dickie Coggins. You got Francis Coggins in Marbella. His wife's not very well, Mrs. Coggins. Well, and to be honest with you, I wish her all the best. It's not her fault, is it? You know, you can't blame her, but she's suffering from cancer, Mrs. Coggins. That's Francis's wife in Marbella. But yeah, you see, and what's happened is the daughters now have taken over the money laundering, Darren. You know, there's one daughter in particular that's got all the business. She flies around the world with like an entourage of scousers, like tough guys, bodyguards, and they create sort of fear wherever they go. I've had people in Bali tell me that they go to Bali, in Indonesia causing trouble. They go to Marbella, Port of Banus, Dubai and all that. So it's being passed down the family. But the next generation, though, Darren, which people don't understand, is the girls, the women are just as ruthless as the men.
You know, when I mentioned earlier on Gerard, and you called him Uncle Bob Gerard, he's due out of custody in about 16 months' time, isn't he? Do you reckon he's going to jump right back into the fold of what's been going on?
Is the Pope a Catholic? Of course he will. What else is he going to do? Because in that world, you know, Darren, within 6 or 9 months, you can get several £1 million, right, profit. I mean, there's an Irish criminal called Brian Rattigan. He was released last year from jail, went to Spain. He's with John Gilligan, John Cunningham. He's got Gerard Scarface Lynch in Dublin. In 9 months, Darren, he's got 25 million euros profit in his back pocket. So that's, what else are they going to do? I mean, what else do these people do? We know that.
So referring back to the 80s, mate, have you ever been aware of a name called Frank Lowe?
Frank Lowe, only historically when I've done research. I never sort of came into any contact with him. But I mean, again, you're talking about sort of like 1.5 generations ago, aren't you? He was there with, is it that man, Mr. Gilday was another one. There was Fat Stan. Do you remember Fat Stan?
Yeah.
He was another one at Huyton. Because actually, Fat Stan was the patriarch. He was the original OG in Huyton. And the likes of Vincent, Coggins, Jarvis and Earl and all them, they were after Fat Stan. And now people think that they're the
Are
original.
you speaking about Stan Carnell?
I think so. All I know is Fat Stan. You would know more than what I do, but you know who I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah, there's a couple of Fat Stans. I've been in prison with a Fat Stan, and he's currently gone back to prison in the last 5 years. So